Welcome to Why Vulnerability Assessment. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at vulnerability assessment, compliance and project scoping, assessing current network concerns, network vulnerability assessment methodology, policy review, top-down methodology, technical, bottom-up methodology. When you think of a vulnerability assessment, you're going through and identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing or ranking the vulnerabilities that we have on a system. We do a great deal of analysis of our various computer systems, our targets, computer systems, routers, switches, whatever it may be, looking for weaknesses, technical flaws, vulnerabilities. We also can look at it from a perspective of disaster management, because if we think about these threats and what they could do to us, it could really harm the company in the long run. So when you think again with a vulnerability assessment, we are going through systematically and examining our critical infrastructure, our components that could be at risk, and really evaluating what we can do about these possible risks that we have, and maybe something we can do to mitigate or reduce the impact from these risks. So we have a systematic examination of the information system or the product to determine the adequacy of what we have already. We want to evaluate if we have any weaknesses or deficiencies in our current setup to make sure we are actually as secure as we possibly can be within reason. Why should we do a vulnerability assessment? What are the benefits? Again, we're trying to protect a company here. We're trying to stay secure. We would like to stay in business. And if we don't have our computer security together and not aware of what our weaknesses are, we could catch ourselves rather vulnerable. So you will hear people talk about a vulnerability assessment and then leading into what they call a penetration test as well, in some cases. The vulnerability assessment is going to be very beneficial because we are going to note weaknesses, but if we decide to go forward, or the company decides they wish us to go forward, and actually see if we can punch through their systems, then we actually call it a penetration test. That's more of like playing an ethical hacker at that point. If we are aware of our weaknesses, then by doing a vulnerability assessment, then we are less likely to have network downtime due to these weaknesses, because there may be something we can do about these to counter these problems. Justify security investment, see if we even meet regulatory requirements. We could be in the medical industry and have HIPAA regulations to work with and requirements by law to protect that information. Also, it may be just to stay in business and keep our customers happy and make sure we don't lose our customers due to a lack of planning on our part. What are vulnerabilities? Documented problems or errors that can be used by essentially bad guys, used by people to get in your system in a way that was never intended. And there's vulnerabilities that we don't even know are there yet. If Microsoft could go ahead and patch every vulnerability and they could just figure out what every vulnerability is and will be in the future, that would be great. But there's always going to be some new way that a hacker finds to get into our systems. So the idea of having a network vulnerability assessment is to try to find out what are the holes in our network. And maybe there's something we can do to try to counter or mitigate those problems. So what are our flaws? That's really what we're asking. What are the flaws? With security vulnerability lifecycle, this is the problem. Okay. We actually have, the product comes out, vulnerability gets figured out, modifications are made, patches released, but then there's that period of time where people say, well, I don't think we're going to apply these patches yet. We're not really sure if they're going to hurt us, so we better wait a little while. Maybe we'll wait a month, 2 months. I have actually heard that, even as much as 2 months or more. And then finally the patch gets deployed at the customer site. The problem is the hackers know what the weakness is because the patch has been released and all they have to do is reverse engineer what the patch does. So now they know what it fixes, also knowing that the customer is likely to have delayed deployment of the patching, so therefore you basically told them what the weakness is, and they're weak and they're vulnerable, and it's very likely the bad guy, the hacker, can get in. Compliance and project scoping. The idea of kind of going toward putting together a network vulnerability assessment. We're trying to develop the scope of the project, and that's the early work when we decide what the boundaries we were going to set to the work of our project. We're trying to think of the limits, how far we're going to take this. Are there any physical limits of what we're going to do our assessment on? Maybe there's parts of the organization that we're not going to be doing the vulnerability assessment on those parts, because I say stay clear of this particular location or department. How much, if not all, of the network will be reviewed? How many people will be consulted? Maybe the customer employees don't even know that we're doing this, or maybe a few of them know. Okay. And the idea with this, also, most failed projects come to grief because the scope of the project was poorly defined to begin with. Maybe we started out with certain ideas, but they weren't well written, and then it just kind of started going its own direction, and it really wasn't within our control. So we do want to control the project. We want to have a really good plan. We want to start out with what they call a project overview statement, and then develop a project scope document. We want our project overview statement to be 1 page, simple in its statements, clear in its objectives. What should it contain? Project definition, short description of the purpose of the project. Project goal, 1 or 2 sentences that state the problem or weakness the project will address. Objectives, a short list of objectives to be met. Success factors. Quantification usually is hard numbers. Quantification of the benefits of doing the project. In other words, this is where we convince them and spell out, this is why you want to do this. This is going to save you money. It's a good idea. Assumptions. Details of the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats involved in the project. Keep it simple. Here's an example, the project overview. So you can see the project definitions, objectives, success factors, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We want good, clean definition of what our project will entail. Assessing your current network concerns. As far as vulnerabilities, we can have vulnerabilities in anything that exists. Vulnerabilities and our web servers, very common. Vulnerabilities within the protocols. What about the operating systems? We have different vulnerabilities for Windows versus Linux and Unix. The client systems, the systems in between, could be routers, switches. Vulnerabilities in our network. We think of our hubs, which we hopefully don't have any. But hubs is where we could connect PCs that way, but most of us have moved on to switches, which have their own set of vulnerabilities. Routers interconnect to networks. Firewalls are not perfect. Firewalls have vulnerabilities as well. They have to be properly configured. More concerns. We can't control everything. Security mess-ups with email. Denial of service attacks. Spying. Computer viruses. We're always trying to keep people from downloading viruses from email, downloading attachments which may be viruses, but somebody will slip through many times and you get infected. Hackers, we could have hackers internal, we could have hackers external. The disgruntled employee could have wishes to harm us as well. Network vulnerability assessment methodology. Here's some definitions or key terms. Risk. Probability that a threat will exploit the vulnerability to adversely affect what you have, your assets. Threats, this could be an event, the occurrence of which could have an undesired impact. Okay. Threat impact, where you measure the magnitude of the loss or harm because of what has just happened. Threat probability, the chance that the event will occur and or a specific loss value will occur. Safeguards, something we can put in place that will actually try to detect, prevent, or minimize loss. We put things in place to prevent loss, but it's not an absolute. Many times when we think about doing vulnerability assessments and then putting some sort of safeguard in place, sometimes called countermeasure or control. A lot of times we consider it to be reducing the risk, not necessarily eliminating the risk. Vulnerability is when we don't have that risk-reducing safeguard, the absence or the weakness of the risk-reducing safeguard. With the network vulnerability assessment methodology, basically outlines the steps that security people should follow in performing this network vulnerability assessment. Demonstrates a commitment following along with the ISO standard 17799 and also CISSP has their common body of knowledge as criteria for security assessments. We use these. And we're going to continue with this and look at some of the subtasks and the phases. Phase 1, data collection. We cannot forget the laws. We do have to look at applicable laws, state as well as federal, affecting the client. We review available documentation. We draw up a list of known bugs, many times software bugs and security vulnerabilities to test on the systems. Based on what they have, they've got Windows 7 Service Pack 1, then we could look for known bugs for Windows 7 Service Pack 1. Phase 2, we could go through interviews, information reviews, and hands-on investigation. We define roles and functions about which it wants to gather information. We have also who's going to lead it, the team lead, the point of contact. We're going to have an interview schedule. We're going to arrange these interviews. We're going to appropriate members of this NVA team are basically identified. And we request additional documents that we didn't get in phase 1. The NVA team requests additional interviews as needed. Team leader requests facility network clearance and passwords for the team members from the point of contact as needed. And the team tours computing facilities, conducts tests of the operating systems, hardware, network devices, software. And they also tour facilities and perform physical plant inspection. Phase 3 would include risk analysis, looking at security policies, threat analysis. Continuing with analysis, they'll have to identify what network concerns have the highest priority. And of course, we try to look at those systems that we think would be impacted the most. There's going to be a sort of a triage or priority. And we also use all the resources we have to figure out what threats will be addressed and try to prioritize what's going to have the greatest probability of getting impacted by security events. We could also look at developing a checklist to assist our team, looking at our basic security controls. Now this section, risk management. Okay, risk management, you see it does not say risk elimination. That would be perfect but unreasonable. Risk management, we know that there's risk out there. Our goal is to get them where they're livable, to a level that we can live with it. To eliminate, we could just simply not have a business that uses computers and not be connected to the internet and keep everything turned off and never, interact. But to be a business, we have to put ourselves out there. There's computers that run the business. We are connected, most likely. So we have to look at how to exist and yet reduce our risk to a point that's acceptable. So we manage our risk. So we first have to also look at risk analysis. We have to look at what are the assets? What are they valued as? What could harm these assets? We look at the vulnerabilities and the threats. We have to do some calculations, many times mathematical, which we'll see. Estimate. It is a lot of guesswork. Estimate the potential loss and damage and try to come up with some ideas of what we can do to, reduce our risk, mitigate our risk. Unfortunately, with risk management, there is a lot of guesswork. We are trying to predict what could happen, predict the future. We're trying to imagine the possibilities, number of variables to identify, looking at all the possible threats and what could we do to try to counter these threats. And we may find ourselves gathering information from a variety of sources, and it's not just an absolute. It's the quantifying and quantifying qualitative and quantitative, quantifying qualitative. You're going to see a mix of the two, and you're going to see that not everything is hard numbers. Risk analysis objectives. The purpose of risk analysis, I mean, really, it's acting responsibly as a company. It is something companies use to see what the risks are so they can try to do what they can to reduce those risks. They do want it to be cost effective. They want it to be useful and be realistic, absolutely realistic. So we'd put together a risk analysis team. We would have people from different departments of the company, and management could decide who the team members are, but you would not want it to be just management people because they really don't understand the different departments as good as someone who works in those departments. As far as doing these analysis, the vulnerability analysis and so on, we're looking at automated tools. We can do some of those. For certain things that are very repetitive, we could use automated tools. We can run through the same data through several scenarios. It's very time consuming. An asset's value is calculated by reviewing. Now, some people think of the asset value of an item to be simply what did it cost initially, but it's more than that. The cost of the acquisition, what would it cost to replace it? Maybe it took some cost or some money to actually develop the asset. How important is this asset in our company? What is its role? What would other people pay for this asset? What do we have? What's it cost to maintain and protect this asset? And production and productivity losses if we did not have this asset, which we might be talking about a server, for example. And what would happen to us liability-wise if we don't protect this asset? As far as some of the vulnerabilities that are out there, but we're not right front and center, lack of security understanding. I think a lot of users do not really comprehend how important security is. And when you think of this, users are just kind of unaware of security. Sometimes they don't even think it's their responsibility. Misuse of access by authorized users. A user may have lots of permissions, but yet if they use those permissions to do something they weren't really supposed to do, then that is considered misuse. And sometimes if a user worked in one department and then moved to another department and then moved again, sometimes we forget to remove their permissions from their previous departments. Like if someone worked in accounting or payroll and had access to that and no longer works there, and now we've got them in another completely different department, human resources, yet they still have the ability to manipulate payroll information. That's a misuse. And the fact that their permissions just kept growing as they moved from job position to job position, that's considered authorization creep. Concentration and responsibility. Usually it's called separation of duties. The idea is we prefer that a user be able to do what they have to do for their job and nothing else, and not have just great power in different areas. It should be, I can do this, but I can't do that. If we don't have the separation of duties, then there's more likelihood that a single person could do something fraudulent. Not being able to react quickly. Maybe we have not put together some sort of response team or even procedures for certain situations. Maybe we have not laid out, if we have a certain incident, who do we communicate with? And maybe we don't have a way to detect fraudulent activities. We haven't considered rotation of duties, moving people from one position to another position, therefore interacting with new people that might pick up on some fraudulent activity that has been going on that computer system. Categorizing risk. With this, we have risk, potential losses, delayed loss. Sometimes you might experience a loss and you think you got through it, but then later on, because of that initial loss, there's more losses that follow. And sometimes that's hard to predict. Examples and types of losses. Okay. Potential losses, loss in production and productivity. Maybe because the system wasn't working. And cost of repairing damages. There's that. Consultants have to come in, loss of revenue, customers. Sometimes if you have a particular loss and the customers lose faith in your company, they move on to another company. It could have been related to some sort of disaster situation, or possibly something a hacker did and you were ill prepared for it. And because the company was not available, our customers moved on. We lost money. Delayed losses, which leads into that. Word gets out that you were hacked. We have less of a reputation. They don't really trust us. They say, well, I'm sure there's other people out there that are running their businesses better than you, perhaps. So we lose the customers down the road because our reputation has been affected. New customers heard about it and they're concerned. Late fees, penalties, market share. As far as risk analysis and looking at the different approaches, it is good to consider both sides. There's quantitative, think of quantity, hard numbers, where you're assigning numeric or monetary values. This is the one I think management listens to. When you start talking about dollars, we're going to make so much money or we're going to lose so much money, management has a tendency to listen, and that's quantitative. You may have initially started out with more of a qualitative approach. Qualitative, you basically could have done some sort of surveys or scenario-based systems. You got the opinions of people. You may have had a survey that had like on a 1 to 7 point scale. 7's really good, 1's really bad. How would you rate this? And you could get some feedback from people. And that would be qualitative, like focus groups. Who uses what you have here? Companies use quantitative. And that makes sense, really, because quantitative is hard numbers, and companies are in business to make money. So that kind of seems like the main reason. Why did we start up a business? Because we thought we could make money off of this business. Most businesses are profit-based, so they're thinking, I do this because it's going to make me rich, or bring in a great income. Government, on the other hand, isn't always in there for the money. Maybe it's military, Department of Defense, things like that. They're in there for national security purposes. They realize that, qualitative makes more sense. We do it because we have to. It's not a money thing. So it would make sense that government agencies could be looking at qualitative. Steps to qualitative analysis. Okay. Remember, qualitative, not quantity. So we're not talking hard numbers. So with this, you could get people together that know about the topic, so-called experts. You could put together some potential what if this happens or that happens, and then do some sort of ranking on a 1 to 10 point scale, 1 to 5 point scale, whatever it may be, and try to get some feedback from the people, and of course rank the countermeasures of what we could use to mitigate these problems, these risks. Delphi method. Another interesting way to go. You have anonymous input, and what's nice about this one is you don't really feel pressured to give a certain answer because they don't really know who gave what answer and their responses, so there's no intimidation. What you'll find out there when you're doing risk analysis, and we're talking about quantitative now, there are these well-known formulas. Single loss expectancy. It's where you take the value of the asset and you multiply it by what we call the exposure factor. Exposure factor, the percentage of loss that could be experienced. Then that could be a large number. And where it becomes even more useful is when you look at it from a yearly perspective. ALE, annualized loss expectancy. With this, you take your number you just did, the single loss expectancy you just got, you multiply it by how often it happens per year, annualized rate of occurrence, and that gives you an idea of how much you could lose based on an event on a yearly basis. And then that could lead us to figuring out how much we're willing to spend to protect an asset, for example. So with the annualized loss expectancy, it really does have a lot of benefits. And of course, it helps categorize risks. We can figure out which risks need to be addressed first. It gives us an idea of how much we're willing to spend on a countermeasure, a control, something to put in place to try to mitigate the risk. You do not want your countermeasure to cost more than what you might lose on a yearly basis, the annualized loss expectancy. It also helps drive a security budget, and where you can actually budget what you're going to have to purchase to make your environment more secure. And just here are some examples, and just kind of showing how we can have different situations. If an e-commerce site is attacked, maybe its value is $300,000, it's estimated to cause a 40% in damages to the company based on these different situations. You put it into formula and essentially multiply it, and say the asset value times the exposure factor, and you get your single loss expectancy, which is just per incident. Now they further that formula, and they say, based on the current things we have in place, the current safeguards, we think this is going to happen maybe once a year, once every 12 months. So now we could go ahead and multiply that, the 120,000 times once a year, in this case 120,000, it didn't really change. But if it were to happen, more than once a year or less than once a year, that number is obviously going to adjust. And the figure you come up with from the annualized loss expectancy, you want to realize management should not spend over this amount to protect the asset. It needs to be cost effective. So they just kind of keep going with this, and they show you, how often it's going to happen, once every 12 months, every 10 years, once every 100 years, and essentially, do a calculation based on how often, annualized rate of occurrence that, whatever your situation is. And it's a bit of prediction, of course. And you'll see these things come up, these calculations also come up when you think about disaster situations, like tornadoes, like hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on as well. So, kind of looking at this, I'm just kind of showing you some various formulas where you do look at it. Let me back up one here. It's worth 650,000, tornadoes expected once every 10 years, damage 35% of the facility. And they're just kind of playing with it and showing how you could plug in those values and see what you would lose potentially per year, SLE, and then figuring out how often it's going to happen with different situations, and then multiplying that out based on how often it occurs, and you end up with your annualized loss expectancy. So you use this value to figure out how much you're going to spend or not to mitigate the risk. Can a purely quantitative analysis be accomplished? No. Generally, you will hear all the security books say we need to mix the two, okay? A quantitative analysis requires quantifying many qualitative items. I mean, some things you just can't put a hard number on. How do you assign a value to reputation? That's an interesting one. What's your reputation worth as a company? How can you know the potential customers that will be lost? How can you properly predict market loss, share loss? So these are more qualitative. So with this, I'll admit we do a lot with quantitative, but qualitative does enter the picture. The annualized cost of countermeasures should not be more than what you could possibly lose. So if a server is only worth $3,000 and a countermeasure is going to cost you $4,000, it doesn't really make sense. That's kind of their rationale. And the idea of a countermeasure, you're not really seeing the word eliminate, you're seeing the word mitigate, okay? You're trying to put a control or a countermeasure in place that would hopefully reduce the likelihood, and you could think of something like an antivirus. An antivirus is a mitigation technique. Maybe a security system for your building, that detects and sets off an alarm and so on, could be some form of mitigation. So, there's a lot that can be looked at. The annualized loss expectancy before implementing your countermeasure, then minus the annualized loss expectancy after implementing the countermeasure, minus the annualized cost of the countermeasure, is the value of the countermeasure to the company. Now, some of these are not absolute mathematical formulas, but they're more like concepts. So essentially, they're just kind of taking you through the possibility of what we could lose, how much you're going to spend, and so on. So if an ALE for a specific asset is $78,000, and after the implementation of the control, the new ALE is $20,000, and the annual cost of the control is $60,000, what is the value of the control to the company? And you'd have to basically plug in the values, and you may come out that you simply should not implement the control, that it was not cost beneficial. So there's a lot that has to be looked at, okay? And when you put a countermeasure in place, realize that it's not just what it costs, it could also be maintenance, It could be the man hours to maintain it, like an intrusion detection system. And it could even have some negative effects in your production environment. Total risk versus residual risk. The point of this slide is to let you realize that you're always going to have something you can't protect against. The amount of risk that exists before a safeguard is put in place is a total risk. After the safeguard is implemented, the remaining risk is residual risk. So it's not really a true math formula, it's a concept, as you can see. And there's some things we just can't protect against, and they call that control gap. So when we look at some of our possibilities as far as mitigation, we could potentially have insurance and transfer the risk to an insurance company. We could, number two, reduce the risk or mitigate it by putting together a control like a firewall, an intrusion prevention system, an antivirus. We could have done the math on it and realized that it wasn't cost effective, so we have to just live with it, accept the risk. Or, they also have reject the risk, no action taken as well. And generally, you may look at even ignore the risk, but the idea with it is you want to do your due diligence, you want to do your research on it, and really not put your head in the sand and ignore it. I mean, you hear some people say, well, just ignore it. But you just have to look at your options here. You have to be responsible. A person in a company, realize the company is liable. The companies are required to exercise what we call due care and do the research and find out what the risks are and try to be responsible with their decisions. So liability of the actions, accepting the risk, rejecting the risk, and essentially if you've done your research, that's your due diligence. And then if you go ahead and go forward with like mitigating a risk, we usually call that exercising due care. So you try to do things with doing the proper research, never putting your head in the sand and going, oh, I don't see that there's any vulnerabilities. We're perfect. Nothing can harm us. And simply not looking into it would be blatantly irresponsible. So rejecting the risk is most likely did not practice your due diligence. You did not do your risk analysis. It was based on ignorance of the issue. You'll most likely be considered negligent. So backing up a little bit, reject the risk. Number 4, don't do that one. That's what it really comes down to. Don't reject the risk because that is negligent. Policy review, top down. With this, it's important to ensure that policies establish the direction management wants to go with regard to security. Top-down review will assess policies in 2 ways. Do they exist? And if so, how good is the content? Now, in general, we do want what we do to be management driven. Just by the way, that works better from a top-down approach. It's usually pretty effective. We will have high-level statements called policies. We may have general program policies that are strategic direction of the enterprise for global behavior and so on. Topic-specific policies addresses specific issues of concern to the organization. Could be email usage, internet usage, phone usage, physical security, and even system or application specific, protecting a particular application or system. Policy types, we could have policies, again, they're organizational. Business needs, laws, regulations, standards of due care. Issue-specific policies, email, internet, system, maintenance of computers and devices. Policies with different goals, we have ones that deal with regulations and laws, regulatory. Advisory, outlines expected behaviors in companies and the ramifications of not meeting what happens if you don't meet those expectations, as well as informative, a tool to teach employees about specific issues, not enforceable. There are best practices out there. You may have heard of them as ISO standards that deal with security. And there are companies sometimes that actually get certified against a standard to make sure they are compliant. Standards generally are considered to be compulsory. They're required. You will hear terms like baselines, a minimum level of security that we have to have in place. Guidelines are generally considered recommendations, really. It's not so really enforceable recommendations. And then procedures are good to write out because they spell out the step-by-step instructions of how, a lot of times, how to follow a given policy. Policy contents, and generally I think this is somewhat of a repeat, but effectively General or global policies, high level, topic specific ones, narrow the focus, and of course system and application specific ones as well, just like it sounds. And again, ISO 17799 relates to this. So when you're looking at a policy, you look at the topic, what it covers, responsibilities, and compliance. Technical, this is important too. Technical bottom-up methodology. We're going to maximize the time spent during the technical phases of a security vulnerability, network vulnerability assessment, NVA. If you ever heard someone talk about a site survey, many times that's going into an environment and really just seeing what you have and evaluating what you have for that given area. Developing a test plan, putting together your toolkit, then doing your assessment, then doing analysis of what you put together during the assessment, and finally, I guess the deliverable, the documentation. Okay, all part of it. So in this chapter, we were looking at vulnerability assessments, compliance, project scoping, current network concerns, network vulnerability assessment methodology, policies top-down, and technical bottom-up methodologies.